Hi, this is John Rowell for the Rowell Report. Today is Saturday, August 30th, 2025, and I'd like to welcome you to my channel. Today I'm taking a look at something that's very important, the tale of two plans, why China succeeded with its 5-year plans versus why the Soviets failed. And this is very important because of the BRICS. Yes, the BRICS, not the building material, but the organization. Initially, this was founded by uh, 5 countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and together they formed BRICS. So, anyway, what is BRICS? BRICS is an economic cooperation among the member states, of course, the ones I mentioned, plus the ones that are um, entering the BRICS cooperation organization. And this creates a counterbalance to the IMF and World Bank, which basically controls large sums of money and decides um, which country gets the money and which doesn't, and what conditions they need to fulfill. Remember that the one child policy in China was the result of the meddling of these organizations in China, the IMF and the World Bank. Also, to the BRICS also exist to increase the influence in geopolitical matters and to help the world get into a cooperative um, mentality rather than hostility mentality, which is the Western mentality of the United States and European countries. So, anyway, let's get right in on this presentation. So anyway, the contrasting economies. Well, remember that the Soviet Union was Russia and all the countries that were incorporated into it, either before or after World War II. So it was a mammoth union of countries, and so it needed to be managed properly because of the size and all the elements that require a properly working economic functioning. So anyway, unfortunately, in the Soviet Union, they were dominated by rigidity and centralization, while in China, when the when the warning signals came around at the right after the death of Mao, they were able to get their act together and reform. So they figured that they would be able to continue on with a centralized political life while um, adapting in terms of the economic factors. So let's take a look at both the Soviet Union and China. So the Soviet model, too much rigidity, unfortunately, the centralized command economy, and all these 5-year plans, which was developed on kind of erroneous economic factors and logistics and all that. Led to you know more problems and dissatisfaction. They tried to resolve them with additional 5-year plans, which only made things worse. So there was a big problem in logistics, widespread shortages, and the factories were there to crank out quotas, to crank out quantities, and the quality of the product wasn't so important. And so the bosses, were very, they just needed to achieve quotas in order to be promoted. And so they didn't care too much about, adapting or quality. And so on a larger scale, this whole attitude led to what they call information breakdown. And so if we move on to the whole problem of the quotas, I know of a refugee from ex-Soviet country, and when he was there, they had to achieve quotas in a pig processing plant. It didn't matter how many employees showed up; they still needed to get the quota. Um, and so this led to long working hours and a lot of dissatisfaction, people calling in sick when they weren't sick, and a lot of inefficiencies, just problems everywhere. So then if you go from the over centralization of the Soviet Union economic life to the decentralization of China, you can see that they were able to adapt. So basically, it was adapt or die. And so all these industries, that the Soviet Union had, they were still, leading the world in a lot of areas, in aerospace, in the military. They were adapting, they were figuring things out, but they weren't. This wasn't getting to, consumer goods or agriculture, which was leading to famines and all kinds of problems. The main face of the Soviet Union was the the long lines people had to stand in to get things, the empty shelves, all that. Some people talk now about empty shelves in Russia. That is a total, it's debunked every time someone goes to the supermarket there and records a video. But people continue to repeat it because they want to say that Russia is basically, just continued on the same economic life as the Soviet Union. It's not true, but one thing is true is that the scarcity led to a lot of dissatisfaction. At the same time, the Chinese decided that it was adapt or die, and so they began to develop um, really good, workable 5-year plans under Deng Xiaoping. And so this started in the farms. The farmers were able to sell the products they that were excess from their production. So this started to lead to a free market. And once they were able to make enough money, they were able to buy tractors. If you need a tractor, you need tools, you need a building, you need a mechanic, you know, you need all these different items. But the advantage is once you begin to modernize, then now their economy is beginning to flow. This pulled millions out of poverty, and so they took up this system of special economic zones where they tried out different approaches, and when they figured out how to make it successful, then they repeated it in the rest of the country. This was uh, pushing them forward into innovation, adaptation, better economic life. So there was greater competition and innovation. And so once they were able to compete, then this was driving a lot of development. But those who remember that the products that initially came from China when they began all this development, they were not very good quality. And there were still those elements that you could see kind of like from the Soviet Union, where they weren't innovating, and they weren't doing the quality control. And many times this is because the boss of the factory, the head of the factory, um, uh, you know, was not focusing on that. And so as they move towards, innovation and within the factory, um, and incentives, then that began to change their whole economic life. And so this came through empowerment through ownership. So they started to privatize different sectors. So the old system of the Soviet Union was the boss, and so the boss made the decisions, and the boss didn't need anyone's opinion. Um, but once they began to take control of their economic life through privatization, then you started to see all those improvement in quality of their products that were coming to the United States. So anyone who was here started to see, oh, gosh, they're really starting to get good at what they're doing. So anyway, and there was a lot of government support to keep, their economic life going. And so, this reduced all the what they call the bureaucratic obstacles, something that was, you know, familiar to anyone who was in the Soviet Union, all that, top down. So anyway, flexibility over your ideology. So they decided that, where they needed to maintain their centralized control was in their political life, not in their economy. And this led to great changes in China. Something we know now, that China is growing by giant steps in their economic life and their military strength. So this is starting to worry a lot of Western countries, and they talked about containing China. They're trying to get Japan and Taiwan and South Korea as kind of a containment area for China. And so, if this was the China of the 80s, that would probably work. But now we're in 2025. So, this is doomed to failure from my point of view. But anyway, one thing I wanted to point out for China is that in 1980, there was an attempted coup by the widow of Mao Zedong and several generals. They tried to take back control of the government. They wanted to return to the practices of Mao and the kind of Soviet style leadership, and China rejected that. Those individuals were tried in court and found guilty. And that was, for me, the strongest signal that China was on the road to reform and change and adaptation. So we can all applaud China for all their successes. But anyway, this was a quick look at why China succeeded where the Soviets failed. Thank you for joining me for this video. More to come. Please subscribe and return for more videos on many different topics. Have a great day. Bye bye.